This is KM Weiland, and you are listening to the 448th episode of the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast. I haven't been reading as much these last few years as I used to, or as much as I would like to. There were a lot of factors to this, busyness and distractedness being two of the big ones. For someone who has routinely read over 100 books a year, I've put in rather a poor showing these last few years with just around 40 books, many of which were audiobooks for me this year, a new tack that helped me absorb books even when I wasn't able to sit and concentrate. But I feel like I'm starting to come back into a good reading space. Appropriately, the first book I cracked after my move was Sarah Clarkson's Ode to Reading, Book Girl, which was exactly the right reinvigorating reminder of the wonders of reading to start me off on a new leaf. I'm changing up my reading routine though, focusing less on cramming all my daily reading into a 2-hour evening slot and more in dispersing it throughout the day. A poem before I go out walking, a snippet of Thomas Merton when I first sit down at my desk, a chapter of a novel after lunch, and whatever most interests me, mostly world history right now, for at least a half an hour before bed. I don't know that it will rocket me back up to my old pace of 2 books a week, but I am thoroughly enjoying it. And now, I am pleased to announce that today's podcast is sponsored by Damonza, the excellent cover design company that has produced almost all of the covers for my books, both fiction and non. A picture is worth 1,000 words. That's great, but your novel currently has well over 50,000, and you need a book cover that does every single one of them justice. You know that readers do judge books by their covers, so getting the cover right is crucial. But you're a writer, not a designer. Having designed thousands of covers for self-published authors, Damonza.com's expert design, editing, and marketing teams know exactly how to bring your book to life. Their covers aren't worth 1,000 words. They're not worth 50,000 either. Damonza.com designs covers that say just to read me. And with a string of New York Times bestsellers to their name, they do just that. Damonza.com's goal is simple: make books awesome. Their custom cover design packages start at just $4.95, and you, as a Helping Writers Become Authors listener, can get a further 10% off any of their services by entering the promo code AUTHORS at damonza.com/authors. That's damonza.com/authors with the promo code AUTHORS for 10% off. And now I hope you enjoyed today's topic. When writing, how do you know when enough is enough? Last month, I invited you guys to tell me what topics you'd like me to write about. You flooded my inbox and comment section with suggestions. I actually scheduled this as an easy post that wouldn't require much maintenance while I was in the midst of a big move. So when I logged on that first day to over 100 comments needing to be approved, I was all, wah! However, I'm psyched by your enthusiasm and excited to have such a deep well of ideas to draw from for future posts. So first off, thank you for contributing to the discussion. And second, let's get started. One of the first questions in the queue to catch my eye was Karen Kyle's. My biggest 2 issues have to do with the term enough. How do I know when I have described enough, not described enough, edited enough, not edited enough, dialogued enough, not dialogued enough, been humorous enough, etc.? Now, one of the most difficult things about the art form of writing is how unquantifiable many aspects are. What is story but a great big blast of colors and feels right smack in your face? As a reader or viewer, you just know when something works or it doesn't. Lack of artistic credentials has never been, nor ever should be, enough to hold anyone back from passionately loving or hating a piece of art. Explaining the why of any particular technique's success or lack thereof is much harder. Indeed, even identifying which particular technique is at play sometimes seems like trying to figure out what the elephant is by poking at it in the dark. Although story is a hugely complicated beast made up of thousands of tiny individual pieces, it should never look that way, or at least not when done well. When done well, a story seems like a story. It's cohesive, every piece and every technique flowing effortlessly into the next to create not a mosaic, but a living photograph. That's the beauty of art. Perhaps not surprisingly, it's also the very thing that causes huge pain points for the artist. We must learn to deconstruct the living photograph into the individual pixels that create it. Otherwise, we will never be able to identify what's gone wrong when one of the colors is incorrect or oversaturated or blacked out. This is particularly pertinent when it comes to questions of what is enough in any aspect of your story. The reason this is a difficult problem is the very fact that it is so abstract. There are no concrete answers. What might be enough description or dialogue in one section of the story will not be enough in another section. Learning to understand when enough is enough in your story is largely a matter of refining your storytelling instincts to the point where you can just feel whether something is too sparse or too excessive. So how do you learn to refine those instincts? What that question is really asking is, how do you take your vague, sometimes hard to access feelings about your story and turn them into a conscious understanding based on quantifiable parameters? Ultimately, that's what the entire pursuit of story theory and technique has been about for me. You could argue that the entire body of work I've created on my blog and my how-to books has been my effort to answer that question. But today, in response to Karen's question, let's specifically look at ways you can quantify when you've done enough in the 4 sections that she's highlighted. Question number 1, how much description is enough? Why not start with the toughest one first, right? Finding that sweet spot between too much description and not enough description is a tricky one for many writers. Most of us start out info dumping descriptive details like a garbage truck the day after Christmas. We want readers to see everything we see. Every room of the character's childhood house, every freckle on the love interest's nose, every piece of clothing in the protagonist's warrior ensemble. But then, somewhere along the line, a wise beta reader slaps us with the dictate to trim the description. So we overcompensate, looking for that one right telling detail that pops the whole setting without requiring detailed descriptions. And then another beta reader tells us, I can't get any kind of sense of the setting these characters are supposed to be in. It's maddening. This seesawing between extremes is, however, an important part of honing those storytelling instincts. Learning to find the sweet spot of enough description is very much a matter of trial and error. Last spring, I wrote an entry in the Most Common Writing Mistakes series about too much description. In it, I wrote over-the-top examples of what too much description looked like. And then I went hunting for examples from some of my favorite authors of what the just right amount of description looked like. Ironically, many of their excellent descriptions actually ended up being longer than the egregious examples I created. And the lesson here is that enough description has nothing to do with word count. It has everything to do with pertinence, with finding the right details, and looking at settings, people, and objects through the strict viewpoint of narration. You need to know exactly what effect you're trying to achieve in any given passage. Is the whole point to introduce the setting? Well, then maybe you can get away with a chapter's worth of description, as Thomas Hardy famously did in Return of the Native. Or maybe not. Is the point to quickly enliven a walk-on character? Then a swift, well-chosen detail will likely suffice. Is the scene focused on advancing the plot? Then opt for interspersing details throughout the scene as the characters interact with them. Study how your favorite authors utilize description. Even go so far as to copy out whole passages of their work. Description is rarely just dumped into a story, one huge paragraph at a time. Most of the time, it is a living, breathing part of the story, interacting with every other part, sentence by sentence, and even word by word. Question number 2, how much editing is enough? Now we're going to take a temporary step back from the nitty-gritty of actual technique to look at the broader topic of how much time we should be spending on the story itself. To me, the question of when should I stop editing shares the same pitfalls as the question of when should I write the end. Lewis Carroll said it with appropriate gravity in Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. "Begin at the beginning," the king said very gravely, "and go on till you come to the end. Then stop." In short, just as choosing when to write the end to your story is not an arbitrary decision, neither is choosing when you stop editing. You stop editing when the story is finished, when there is nothing more to fix. Now, that may sound a little blithe. After all, most of us agree with Leonardo da Vinci that art is never finished, only abandoned. And it's true. There is always something an author wants to change about a story. We are always growing, always learning, which means the totality of understanding we bring to a story on any given day will always be surpassed by what we have learned on the next. Plus, there's the little fact that our intent always grows faster than our ability to execute it. Still, there are quantifiable ways in which to judge whether or not a story has reached a reasonable level of completion in both the writing and the editing. For the most part, both approaches overlap. There are 2 fundamental questions I ask myself to help me know whether I'm finished with a story or not. Number 1, is the story structurally complete? The only way to know whether a story has reached its end, whether it is a complete whole, is to examine whether or not it is structurally cohesive and complete. When structure is observed, you never have to guess when it's time to end a story. It just ends itself after the climactic moment. And 2, is there anything specific left to change? Even after you've written/edited your story into a state of structural wholeness, you will very likely still find weaknesses to fix. A structurally sound story doesn't, by any means, instantly qualify as a good story. You may still find yourself identifying any number of issues, everything from sloppy prose, too much or too little description, to sloppy themes, to ugly plot holes, to ugly scene structure. Don't approach your editing like a street brawl. Don't just go in swinging. Have a plan. Consciously evaluate your story and make a list of all the problems you know need fixing. Then fix them. Then consciously reevaluate your story. Make another list. Fix the problems on the list and repeat and repeat and repeat until there's nothing left on your list. Once you've got an empty list, you're done editing. But what if your list never empties? After all, if there's no such thing as a perfect novel, there will always be more imperfections to address. 2 things. First off, differentiate between things you think might be a problem with the story, aka heretofore unsubstantiated doubts, and things you know are problems. Having doubts about a story is not the same as identifying specific problems that need to be addressed. Second, know when to cut loose. Maybe you will never reach the very end of that list of edits, but there will come a time when you get close enough that it counts. For this, I like deadlines. I tell myself I have 5 years from outline to final edit to get a story right. If it's not right by then, it's time to cut loose and move on. Question number 3. How much dialogue is enough? I'd like to say there's no such thing as too much dialogue, because personally I adore dialogue. But the more accurate approach to the proper amount of dialogue is different, if just as simple. Dialogue becomes too much at the exact moment it isn't pertinent to the story. Often authors will write their way into dialogue in order to figure out a scene or conversation as they go. Dialogue is exceptionally characterizing, so feeling your way through a dialogue section may also be a great way of learning about who your characters really are from the inside out. And this is all fine and well in the first draft, but meandering conversations that only gradually find their way to a point, or just as faulty conversations that exist just for the sake of conversation, are always going to be problematic. Just as you should examine every single sentence of narrative to make sure each one contributes in its own right, so too you should also examine every line of dialogue. If it contributes, either by advancing the plot, developing the character, or revealing important information, then it belongs. If not, it's too much. One of an author's most important, and in some ways most difficult, jobs is being able to identify the purpose of each word in the narrative. Once you do this, it becomes easy to identify which ones belong and which ones do not. And question number 4, how much humor is enough? My response to humor is kind of like my response to dialogue. No such thing as too much, right? Except that too is facetious. Really, what I'm responding to is the element of entertainment both dialogue and humor bring to a story. And I do dearly love to be entertained. If your humor is entertaining, that is, it works, then you've already aced its primary reason for existing. Beyond that, humor shares other qualifiers with dialogue in that it must be pertinent to the story. Funny can't exist just to be funny. It must offer resonance and contribute to cohesion. But do you need humor? I honestly can't think of a single story that can't benefit from a meaningful inclusion of humor at appropriate moments. But humor, perhaps more than any other element of the story, must flow. You can't force it. It must arise from the situations and characters you've already created. Whenever you have the opportunity to include humor, go for it. But if those opportunities aren't arising, don't worry. However entertaining humor may be, it's not a prerequisite to an amazing story. There's many a great story out there that cracks nary a smile. Know what effect you're trying to achieve in your writing and stick to that with confidence. The enough you're seeking will always find its balance when you're able to realize your intended effect. If, by the story's end, you've succeeded in creating that effect, then your story is enough. If not, it's time to go back and figure out whether you're missing the mark because you've included too much or too little of any of the above elements. So tell me what you think. Do you struggle with knowing when enough is enough in certain areas of your writing? If you'd like to be a part of the community on my site and join in the conversation, please stop by the website at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com. If you're looking for a transcript of the most recent podcast, and also for the comment section, you can add your voice to the discussion by visiting the first post on the site's homepage. And if you are looking for an older post from an older podcast, you can always find those by putting the podcast title in the search field that's found at the top of the right-hand column if you're on a desktop computer, and at the very bottom of the whole site if you're on a mobile device. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe on iTunes. And if you'd like to support Helping Writers Become Authors, I would totally appreciate it if you'd consider taking the time to leave just a quick rating or review on iTunes. Thank you so much for listening to the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast, and be sure to check back again next week.